Mom, phones are for young people. You don't need all that tech stuff anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone discarding yesterday's newspaper. My own daughter had just told me I no longer belonged in the modern world. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Linda Rose. I'm 76 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed that the love I'd poured into my daughter for nearly 5 decades would somehow protect me when I needed it most. I was wrong in ways that still take my breath away. The fluorescent lights in Diane's kitchen cast harsh shadows across her face as she plucked my smartphone from my trembling fingers with the efficiency of someone confiscating contraband. My phone, the lifeline that connected me to the few friends I had left, to my doctor's appointments, to the world beyond these suffocating walls, disappeared into her kitchen drawer with a finality that made my chest tighten. "Just rest, Mom," she said, not meeting my eyes. "You don't need to worry about staying connected anymore." Connected, as if my need for human contact was some frivolous luxury, like wanting expensive jewelry or exotic vacations. As if at 76, I had somehow crossed an invisible threshold where curiosity, communication, and basic dignity were no longer my birthright. I stood there in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops I'd helped pay for and stainless steel appliances that gleamed with the prosperity I'd sacrificed to provide, feeling smaller than I had since I was a child being scolded for speaking out of turn. The woman who had raised her, who had worked double shifts at Philadelphia General Hospital for 39 years to give her every opportunity, had just been dismissed like a malfunctioning appliance. The basement room she'd assigned me sat at the bottom of carpeted stairs that creaked with each careful step I took, my arthritic knees protesting the descent into what felt increasingly like exile. No windows, no natural light, just a fold-out cot positioned between the washing machine and the water heater, surrounded by the mechanical hums and clicks of household utilities that seemed more welcome in this space than I was. "It's cozy," Diane had said when she first showed me the room, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "And so convenient. You'll have everything you need right here. Everything except dignity. Everything except respect. Everything except the basic acknowledgement that I remained a human being worthy of consideration rather than a burden to be managed as efficiently as possible." The walls were painted a cheerless beige, the same color as institutional buildings designed to house people nobody wanted to think about. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made the space feel more like a storage room than living quarters. The air smelled perpetually of detergent and dampness, a constant reminder that I was surrounded by the detritus of family life without being considered part of it. I'd come here 3 weeks ago after what Diane called the incident, a minor stumble in the grocery store that had resulted in a bruised hip and a doctor's recommendation that I shouldn't live alone anymore. At 76, with blood pressure medication that occasionally made me dizzy and reflexes that weren't quite what they used to be, even I could acknowledge that some adjustments to my living situation might be prudent. But this wasn't adjustment. This was erasure. Just for a while. Diane had promised when she'd insisted I pack my belongings and move into her house in the suburbs outside Philadelphia, until we figure out something more permanent. The way she'd said permanent should have warned me. There was something ominous in her tone, a finality that suggested the something permanent she had in mind wouldn't involve consulting my preferences or respecting my autonomy. I'd raised Diane alone after her father walked out when she was 9 years old, abandoning us with unpaid bills and broken promises that left scars deeper than either of us liked to acknowledge. I'd worked every available shift at the hospital, manning the reception desk where I balanced budgets, answered phones, and comforted families who had just lost loved ones. I'd learned to deliver bad news with compassion and good news with appropriate joy, to remain professional when people screamed at me about things beyond my control, to find solutions when the system failed the people who needed it most. Those skills had served me well in raising a daughter who'd inherited her father's tendency toward selfishness, but none of his charm. I'd sold my wedding ring to pay for her college tuition, skipped meals so she could participate in activities with her classmates, worked overtime to afford the clothes and experiences that would help her fit in with children whose families had resources I could only dream of providing. Every sacrifice had felt worthwhile when I watched her graduate with honors, when she landed her first job at an accounting firm, when she married Craig and bought this house with its professional landscaping and 3-car garage. I'd felt proud of what we'd accomplished together, of the stability and prosperity that my years of struggle had made possible for her. I never imagined that the same hands I'd once held while teaching her to walk would one day push me into silence. The evening after she confiscated my phone, I sat on my cot listening to the sounds of family life happening above my head. The television playing shows I wasn't invited to watch, conversations about plans I wouldn't be included in, laughter that never seemed to drift down to where I waited in the dark. Craig's heavy footsteps moved across the kitchen floor as he helped himself to leftovers from dinner. Diane's lighter steps followed, and I could hear the domestic sounds of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher, the refrigerator opening and closing, the comfortable routines of people who belonged in their own home. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt like I belonged anywhere. The photo album sat buried beneath a pile of winter coats in the basement closet, its leather cover cracked and faded from years of handling. I'd found it while searching for a warmer blanket. The basement was always cold, and Diane had mentioned that heating the whole house was expensive. As I flipped through pages yellowed with age, each image told the story of a woman who had given everything, only to discover that everything wasn't enough. There was 5-year-old Diane on her first day of kindergarten, wearing the dress I'd sewn by hand because the store-bought ones were beyond our budget. I'd worked until 2 a.m. for 3 nights straight, my fingers pricked and sore from the needle, determined that my daughter would look as beautiful as any child from a wealthier family. Another photo showed us at her high school graduation. I was wearing the same navy blue dress I'd owned for 6 years, the fabric thin from countless washings, but my smile was radiant. Diane had graduated summa cum laude, and I'd known that every double shift, every skipped meal, every sacrifice had been worth it for this moment. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now viewing these memories in secret, like contraband hidden from the very person I'd sacrificed everything to raise. During those early years after David left, when Diane was still young enough to curl up beside me on our threadbare sofa, I'd painted pictures of our future with words. "When you're successful," I'd whisper into her hair that smelled of the dollar store shampoo we used, "we'll live in a big house with a garden. We'll travel. We'll never have to worry about money again." She'd believed those stories, and so had I. What I hadn't anticipated was that when success finally came, there would be no we in her version of prosperity. The down payment for this very house, $40,000 that represented 15 years of savings scraped together from hospital paychecks, had come from my retirement account. Diane had been fresh out of college, working at her first accounting job, drowning in student loans and credit card debt despite the tuition money I'd provided. "It's just temporary, Mom," she'd promised when she asked for the loan. "Once Craig and I get established, we'll pay you back with interest. Think of it as an investment in our family's future." I'd signed the papers without hesitation, believing that her success would eventually become our shared security. The promissory note she'd insisted on drawing up had made it feel official, professional, the kind of arrangement that serious adults made with each other. That note was probably still in some filing cabinet upstairs, stamped and notarized, a legal document that had proven less binding than the napkin it could have been written on. 7 years had passed since that transaction. The house had appreciated significantly. I knew because I still received the property tax assessments, forwarded to my old apartment with mechanical regularity. But whenever I gently brought up the loan repayment, Diane's responses had grown increasingly vague and dismissive. "Money's tight right now, Mom. Craig's been passed over for that promotion again. We're still paying off the kitchen renovation. You understand. The market's been terrible. Maybe next year." Next year had become a perpetual postponement, and eventually, I'd stopped asking. Some debts, I'd learned, were paid in ways that had nothing to do with money. Through silence, through acceptance, through the gradual erosion of expectations until asking for what you were owed felt like begging. The basement grew colder as night fell, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. It was the same cardigan I'd worn to Diane's wedding 8 years ago. powder blue wool that had once been my finest garment. Now it was my only warm layer in a house where the thermostat was controlled by people who never ventured into the basement long enough to notice the chill. I thought about the wedding, about how proud I'd felt watching Diane walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than I'd spent on clothing in 5 years. I'd contributed $8,000 toward the reception, money I'd borrowed against my pension because watching my daughter's face light up as she described her dream wedding had made any financial sacrifice seem worthwhile. The wedding photos showed me beaming beside the happy couple, my joy genuine despite the simple dress I'd worn, the only formal outfit I owned. In the pictures, I looked like exactly what I was, a working-class mother who had achieved her greatest success by raising a daughter who would never have to struggle the way I had. What the photos didn't capture was the conversation I'd overheard during the reception, when Diane and her new mother-in-law had stepped away from the dance floor to powder their noses. "Your mother seems sweet," Craig's mother had said, her tone carrying the particular condescension that wealthy people reserved for those they considered quaint but inferior. "She is," Diane had replied, and for a moment, my heart had swelled with pride. Then she'd continued, "She's just very simple, you know? She's never really understood anything beyond paycheck-to-paycheck living, but she tried her best." Simple. The word had cut deeper than any deliberately cruel insult could have. To be dismissed not with anger, but with pity, to be characterized as someone whose entire life's work could be reduced to trying her best, despite obvious limitations. It was a kind of violence I hadn't known how to name at the time. Now, sitting in this basement that felt more like a storage unit than living quarters, I understood that conversation had been a preview of this moment. Diane hadn't suddenly developed cruelty. I'd simply reached the point where my usefulness had expired, and my presence had become an inconvenience. The hospital where I'd worked for nearly 4 decades had given me a retirement party on my last day. The break room had been decorated with streamers and a banner reading, "Thank you for your service," and my colleagues had presented me with a watch engraved with my name and years of employment. Dr. I. Patricia Williams, who had worked the emergency department for most of my career, had made a speech about my dedication and reliability. "Linda has been the backbone of this place," she'd said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "She's the person who remembers every patient's name, who stays late to help families navigate insurance paperwork, who somehow always knows exactly what needs to be done before anyone asks." The watch sat in my purse now, its steady ticking a reminder of a time when my competence had been valued, when my presence had made a measurable difference in other people's lives. For 39 years, I'd been indispensable. For 3 weeks, I'd been invisible. The contrast was devastating in ways I hadn't expected. At the hospital, I'd been Linda Rose, the woman who could solve any administrative crisis, who knew every department's procedures, who could calm angry patients and coordinate complex scheduling with equal skill. In this house, I was simply her, an elderly woman whose needs were inconvenient and whose opinions were irrelevant. The transformation hadn't been gradual. It had been immediate and total, as if crossing the threshold of Diane's house had somehow stripped away not just my independence, but my fundamental identity as a capable human being. I closed the photo album and returned it to its hiding place among the winter coats. The images had served their purpose, not to comfort me with happy memories, but to remind me of who I used to be before I became a problem to be managed. Upstairs, I could hear Diane and Craig settling in for the evening. The television volume increased, and I recognized the opening theme of their favorite crime drama. It was 8 p.m. Their routine never varied. They would watch until 10, then Craig would check the locks while Diane prepared for bed. Neither of them would think to ask if I needed anything. Neither would wonder if I was warm enough, fed enough, or simply lonely enough to appreciate a few minutes of conversation. I was learning that neglect could be as deliberate as cruelty, and sometimes more devastating. To be actively mistreated required acknowledgement of your existence. To be ignored suggested that you had become invisible even to the people who should love you most. The first time they forgot my birthday, I told myself it was an oversight. Everyone gets busy. Important dates slip through the cracks of hectic lives. I spent November 15th alone in the basement, listening to the sounds of normal family life above while staring at the calendar on my phone. The old flip phone I'd managed to keep hidden in my coat pocket, the one relic of independence they hadn't yet discovered and confiscated. 76 years old. I'd imagined this milestone differently. Perhaps a small celebration, a cake, maybe dinner at the restaurant where Diane and I used to go for special occasions when she was younger and still seemed to enjoy my company. Instead, I marked the day by eating a peanut butter sandwich alone while Craig's laughter echoed through the ceiling as he watched football with friends who'd never been told about the elderly woman living below their feet. By evening, when it became clear that my birthday would pass without acknowledgement, I climbed the stairs and found Diane in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with plates that still held remnants of the takeout dinner they'd enjoyed, without inviting me to join them. "Did you remember what today is?" I asked quietly, my voice smaller than I'd intended. She paused, a wine glass suspended halfway to the top rack, and I saw the moment when recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by annoyance. "Oh, right, your birthday." The words came out flat, devoid of warmth or celebration. "I've been so busy with the Johnson account. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. In all my years of working demanding hospital shifts, through every crisis and overtime emergency, I had never forgotten my daughter's birthday, never failed to make it special, even when money was so tight that special meant a homemade cake and a gift purchased from the clearance rack. "We could still do something," I suggested hopefully. "Maybe tomorrow? I saw that Italian place you used to like has a senior discount on—" "Mom," the way she said it, sharp, final, cut through my words like a blade. "I can't just drop everything because you need constant entertainment. Some of us have responsibilities." Responsibilities. As if acknowledging my existence required the same level of commitment as managing a corporate merger. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't the explosive anger that leaves room for apology and reconciliation. This was something colder, the clinical dismissal of someone whose feelings simply didn't register as important enough to consider. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For being born? For aging? For expecting that the child I'd raised might remember the day I'd brought her into the world? Diane didn't respond. She simply continued loading dishes, the clink of plates and silverware providing a percussive soundtrack to my humiliation. That night, I lay on my cot and tried to remember the last time someone had wished me happy birthday with genuine joy. The realization that I couldn't recall such a moment felt like discovering a cavity in my chest where my heart used to be. The microaggressions accumulated like poison in small doses, each incident seemingly insignificant, but collectively devastating. There was the morning I mentioned that my arthritis was particularly painful, hoping for a bit of sympathy, or perhaps some help reaching the ibuprofen on the high shelf in the bathroom upstairs. "Everyone has aches and pains, Mom," Diane replied without looking up from her laptop. "It's part of getting older. You just have to deal with it." There was the afternoon I suggested I could help with dinner preparation, hoping to feel useful and perhaps earn my place at the family table. "We've got it handled," Craig said, not unkindly but with the firm dismissal of someone redirecting a child who'd offered to help with adult tasks. "You should rest." Rest. The euphemism they used for everything they wanted me to stop doing. Stop offering help. Stop making suggestions. Stop existing in ways that required them to acknowledge my presence. There was the evening I asked if I could join them for their weekly movie night, something I'd done regularly during my first few days in the house. "It's kind of a couples thing," Diane explained, her tone suggesting I should have understood this obvious boundary without needing clarification. "You wouldn't really enjoy the movies we watch anyway." Each rejection was delivered with the casual efficiency of someone declining an optional service. Polite enough to avoid seeming deliberately cruel, but clear enough to establish that my inclusion was not desired or welcome. The isolation began to affect me in ways I hadn't anticipated. My appetite diminished until eating felt like a chore rather than nourishment. My sleep became fitful and anxious, filled with dreams where I searched for familiar faces who turned away when I approached them. I found myself checking my reflection in the small mirror above the basement sink, wondering if I'd become visibly repulsive in some way I couldn't identify. My hair, which I'd always kept neatly styled despite our financial limitations, had grown thin and disheveled. My clothes hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. But the worst part was the way I'd begun to internalize their assessment of my worth. When I struggled to open a jar of pickles, instead of asking for help, I told myself that perhaps I really was becoming too frail for normal tasks. When I forgot the name of a movie actress during a mental exercise to keep my mind sharp, I wondered if this was evidence of the cognitive decline they seemed to expect from me. Was I becoming the burden they already treated me as? The question haunted me during the long hours I spent alone, surrounded by the mechanical sounds of household appliances that seemed to have more purpose in this family than I did. Then came the night that shattered whatever illusions I'd maintained about their tolerance for my presence. I'd been feeling unwell for several days, a persistent cough that seemed to worsen in the damp basement air, chills that no amount of blankets could quite dispel, and a fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness. At 76, with a history of respiratory issues, I knew enough to be concerned about symptoms that weren't improving on their own, but asking for medical attention felt like admitting defeat, like confirming their belief that I was a fragile burden requiring constant management. I tried to treat myself with over-the-counter medications, but when the cough became severe enough to keep me awake at night, I realized I needed to swallow my pride and ask for help. "I think I might need to see a doctor," I told Diane the next morning, my voice hoarse from coughing. "This has been going on for almost a week." She looked up from her phone with the expression of someone whose day had just been complicated by an unexpected inconvenience. "It's probably just a cold, Mom. Drink some tea. Take some vitamin C. It feels different," I persisted, hating how weak my voice sounded. "I'm having trouble breathing at night." "You're probably just anxious," Craig interjected from behind his newspaper. "Old people always think every little symptom is serious." Old people. Not older adults or even seniors. Just old people. Spoken with the dismissive tone reserved for a demographic whose concerns were inherently suspect. "But what if it's—" "Mom," Diane's voice carried a warning that stopped my words mid-sentence. "You're being dramatic. If it was serious, you'd have a fever or something obvious. You're just getting worked up over normal aging." That afternoon, when my cough became so severe that I could barely catch my breath, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. I called 911 from my hidden flip phone. The paramedics who responded were professional and kind, treating me with the respect and concern that I'd almost forgotten I deserved. After examining me and checking my vital signs, they recommended immediate transport to the emergency department. "Ma'am, you have all the symptoms of pneumonia," the younger paramedic explained gently. "At your age, this isn't something to wait on. You need antibiotics and probably some breathing treatments. Pneumonia, a serious condition that could have been life-threatening if I'd continued to follow my family's advice to treat it with tea and vitamins." When Diane and Craig arrived at the hospital, summoned by the emergency contact information I'd provided, their reaction wasn't relief or concern for my well-being. It was anger. "Why didn't you tell us it was this serious?" Diane demanded, her voice sharp with accusation rather than worry. "I tried," I whispered, my voice still weak from the oxygen treatments. "You said I was being dramatic." "Well, you should have been more clear," she snapped. "Now we have to deal with insurance paperwork and ambulance bills. This could have all been avoided if you'd just explained yourself better." Even lying in a hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines, I was still somehow the problem. Still the inconvenience who'd failed to properly communicate the severity of her condition to people who'd made it clear they didn't want to hear about her problems in the first place. As I lay there that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the hospital where I'd worked for so many years, a terrible question began forming in my mind. Was I used? The thought felt like betrayal. Of Diane. Of myself. Of every sacrifice I'd made over the decades. But as I reviewed the pattern of our relationship with the clarity that sometimes comes during moments of crisis, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that my love had been systematically exploited by someone who'd learned to take without giving, to receive without gratitude, to benefit without reciprocation. Had I raised a daughter, or had I created a predator who wore the mask of family obligation while draining me of everything I had to offer? The question would haunt me through the remaining weeks in their house, as I began to see our interactions through new eyes, and started planning what would become the most important decision of my life. The discharge papers from the hospital felt heavier than they should have in my trembling hands. Pneumonia. Bacterial, the doctor had specified. The kind that could have killed me if I'd waited much longer to seek treatment. "Mrs. Rose," Dr. Martinez had said during my final consultation, her dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses, "you need to understand that at your age, this type of infection is nothing to minimize. The fact that you waited so long to come in," she'd paused, studying my chart with the careful attention of someone choosing her words diplomatically. "Do you have adequate support at home?" The question had hung in the antiseptic air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to confront at the time. Adequate support. Such a clinical way to describe the fundamental failure of the people who were supposed to care about my well-being. "Yes," I'd lied, because the truth was too complicated and too shameful to explain to this competent stranger. How could I tell her that my own daughter had dismissed my symptoms as attention-seeking behavior? That I'd been made to feel like a hypochondriac for recognizing signs of serious illness? But now, 3 days after returning to the basement that passed for my living quarters, the doctor's question echoed in my mind with growing urgency. Did I have adequate support? Or had I been systematically conditioned to accept inadequate treatment as normal? The antibiotics were working. My cough had diminished, and I could breathe without the frightening wheeze that had sent me to the emergency room. But my recovery seemed to irritate Diane and Craig more than my illness had. "The prescription copays were $63, Diane announced over breakfast, sliding the receipt across the kitchen counter toward me with the expectant air of someone presenting a bill. "And the emergency room visit probably won't be fully covered by Medicare." I stared at the receipt, noting that it was from a pharmacy I'd never visited, for medications I'd never seen the full cost of. "I thought you picked these up for me because I was too sick to go myself." "I did," she replied, her tone suggesting I should be grateful for this inconvenience she'd endured on my behalf. "But obviously you need to reimburse us. We can't absorb medical expenses for everyone." Everyone. As if I were some random person they'd graciously assisted, rather than the mother who'd sacrificed decades of her life to ensure Diane never wanted for anything. "I don't have $63 in cash," I admitted, feeling the familiar flush of shame that came with being forced to discuss my financial limitations. My Social Security check barely covered my modest expenses, and since moving into their house, I'd been contributing what I could toward utilities and groceries without being asked. "Well, you'll have to figure something out," Craig said from behind his morning newspaper. "We can't just eat costs because you don't plan ahead for medical emergencies." Plan ahead. As if I'd somehow chosen to develop pneumonia as a recreational activity rather than experiencing a serious illness that required immediate treatment. This conversation planted the first seed of what would become a revolutionary thought. Maybe their convenience wasn't more important than my survival. The idea grew stronger over the following weeks as I began to pay attention to patterns I'd previously accepted without question, like the way they discussed vacation plans at dinner, elaborate trips to destinations I'd never see, while mentioning in the same breath that heating the basement was too expensive to consider. Or the way Craig would leave restaurant receipts on the kitchen counter after business dinners that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, while suggesting I should be more careful about how much milk I consumed because dairy products were getting expensive. Or the way Diane would spend 40 minutes on the phone with friends, laughing and chatting about trivial social drama, while cutting me off after 30 seconds when I tried to share news about former colleagues from the hospital. The double standard was so blatant, so systematic, that I began to wonder how I'd failed to see it before. Had my love for Diane been so complete that it had blinded me to her fundamental lack of reciprocal affection? Or had I simply trained myself not to notice behaviors that would have been obviously unacceptable from anyone else? The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early December, when Craig's mother came for dinner. Eleanor Morrison was 72 years old, impeccably dressed, and accustomed to being treated with the deference that comes from having money and social status. She lived in a luxury retirement community in Bala Sinwid, drove a recent model Lexus, and spoke about her various activities, bridge club, charity committees, cultural events, with the confidence of someone whose time was considered valuable by everyone around her. "Where's your mother?" Eleanor asked Diane as they settled in the living room with wine before dinner. "She's downstairs," Diane replied casually. "She prefers the quiet down there. Gets overwhelmed by too much social interaction. Gets overwhelmed." Another euphemism that transformed deliberate exclusion into consideration for my supposed limitations. "Well, bring her up," Eleanor said, surprising me with her directness. "I'd like to meet her properly. We've only spoken briefly at your wedding." I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly smoothed my hair, wishing I'd had more notice to make myself presentable for company. When Diane appeared at the bottom of the basement steps, her expression was tight with poorly concealed annoyance. "Mom, Craig's mother would like to say hello," she said, her tone suggesting this was an imposition she hadn't anticipated. "Can you come up for a few minutes?" The living room felt strange and formal after weeks of basement exile. Eleanor rose to greet me with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to social interactions, but her sharp eyes took in details I hoped weren't too obvious: my weight loss, my worn clothing, the general air of someone who hadn't been thriving. "Linda, how lovely to see you again," she said warmly, gesturing for me to sit beside her on the sofa I'd helped purchase but rarely used anymore. "Diane tells me you worked at a hospital for many years. How interesting. Which department?" For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor asked thoughtful questions about my career, my life in Philadelphia, my interests and experiences. She listened to my answers with genuine attention, responding with relevant follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually engaging with what I said rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. It was the longest conversation I'd had with another adult in months, and I felt something awakening in me that I'd almost forgotten existed. The sense that I was a person worth knowing, worth listening to, worth treating with basic respect. "You must have fascinating stories from all those years in hospital administration," Eleanor said. "The things you must have seen, the crises you helped people navigate. What remarkable work." Remarkable work. When was the last time anyone had characterized my contributions to the world in positive terms? When had anyone last treated my experiences as valuable rather than burdensome? But what happened next changed everything. As Eleanor prepared to leave, I offered to help clear the dinner dishes, a gesture that had become automatic despite being consistently declined. "Oh, that's not necessary," Diane said quickly. "Mom gets tired easily. She should go rest." Eleanor paused in putting on her coat, studying Diane's face with the shrewd expression of someone who'd learned to read social dynamics over 7 decades of careful observation. "Tired easily?" she repeated. "Linda, you seem quite energetic to me. In fact, you remind me of myself at your age. Plenty of vitality left, just needing the right environment to flourish." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Craig shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Diane's smile became rigidly artificial. "Well, every situation is different," Diane said finally, her voice carrying a warning edge that I recognized, but Eleanor seemed immune to. "Indeed they are," Eleanor replied evenly. "Linda, I host a weekly bridge game at my community center. Very casual, just coffee and conversation with some delightful women. You might enjoy it. Thursdays at 2 o'clock. I don't drive anymore," I said automatically, the excuse emerging before I could consider whether I actually wanted to decline the invitation. "Nonsense! I'll pick you up," Eleanor said briskly. "It's barely 20 minutes from here. I insist." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone who'd been drowning so gradually she'd almost stopped noticing the water closing over her head. "That's very kind," I began, "but I wouldn't want to impose—" "She really doesn't go out much anymore," Diane interrupted, her tone final. "She's more comfortable staying close to home." Eleanor's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained pleasant. "I see. Well, the invitation stands whenever you feel ready for a small adventure." After Eleanor left, the house felt different, charged with an energy that made the familiar spaces seem suddenly foreign. Diane and Craig cleaned up with unusual efficiency, their movements sharp and purposeful, their conversation limited to necessary coordination. I retreated to the basement, but instead of feeling like exile, it felt like strategic withdrawal. For the first time in months, I had something to think about besides my own inadequacy. Eleanor Morrison had seen me differently than my own family did. Where they saw burden, she saw potential. Where they saw limitation, she saw opportunity. Where they saw someone who needed to be managed, she saw someone who might have something valuable to contribute. That night, lying on my cot while the house settled into its usual evening routines above me, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I was going to call Eleanor Morrison and accept her invitation to Bridge Club, and I was going to do it without asking permission. The phone number was written on a small piece of paper that Eleanor had slipped into my hand during our goodbye, a gesture so subtle that Diane and Craig hadn't noticed the exchange. I'd hidden it in my coat pocket like a secret treasure, checking throughout the week to make sure it was still there, still real, still representing the possibility of life beyond these basement walls. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with December frost coating the windows and my breath visible in the unheated basement air. Upstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of Diane and Craig preparing for their workday, coffee brewing, news anchors discussing topics that seemed to matter to people who still felt connected to the larger world. I waited until I heard their cars pull out of the driveway before climbing the stairs to use the kitchen phone. My hands shook as I dialed Eleanor's number. Not from the cold, but from the terrifying possibility that this small act of independence might somehow be discovered and punished. Eleanor Morrison speaking, came the crisp, confident voice that I remembered from dinner. Mrs. Morrison, this is Linda Rose, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. You mentioned Bridge Club? Linda, how wonderful to hear from you, dear. Yes, Bridge Club this afternoon. Are you calling to accept my invitation? The warmth in her voice was like sunlight after weeks of cloudy weather. If the offer still stands? Of course it does. I'll pick you up at 1:30. We like to arrive early for tea and conversation before the cards come out. Do you remember how to play bridge, or would you prefer to observe this first time? I did remember bridge, though it had been years since I'd played. During my early days at the hospital, a group of nurses had included me in their weekly games during lunch breaks. It was one of many small pleasures I'd abandoned over the years, as work and family responsibilities consumed more and more of my time and energy. I remember the basics, I said, surprised by the steadiness returning to my voice. I might be rusty, but I'd like to try. Perfect. Wear something comfortable and bring your appetite. Martha Chen makes the most divine lemon bars, and she always brings enough to feed a small army. After hanging up, I realized I was smiling for the first time in weeks. Not the strained, artificial expression I'd been wearing around Diane and Craig, but a genuine smile that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep inside me that I'd thought had been permanently damaged. I spent the morning preparing with the careful attention I used to give to special occasions. I took a shower using the good shampoo I'd been hoarding, dried my hair with more care than I'd bothered with in months, and selected the best outfit from my limited wardrobe, a navy blue sweater and gray slacks that had once been part of my professional attire. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I saw glimpses of the woman I used to be, competent, dignified, worthy of respect and friendship. The woman who'd managed hospital crises with calm efficiency, who'd raised a daughter as a single mother, who'd navigated decades of challenges with grace and determination. At 1:30 exactly, Eleanor's silver Lexus pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as she stepped out, elegant in a wool coat and leather gloves, moving with the confident bearing of someone who'd never doubted her right to take up space in the world. I grabbed my coat and purse, pausing only to leave a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to Bridge Club with Eleanor Morrison, back by 6 p.m. Mom. The note felt like a declaration of independence. You look lovely, Linda, Eleanor said as I settled into the passenger seat, surrounded by the scent of quality leather and subtle perfume. Ready for an adventure? The retirement community where Eleanor lived was unlike anything I'd imagined. Pine Manor was less institutional facility and more luxury resort, with manicured grounds, elegant architecture, and residents who moved through the spaces with purpose and vitality. Many people have misconceptions about places like this, Eleanor said as we walked through the main lobby, which featured fresh flowers, comfortable seating areas, and a grand piano where a resident was playing soft jazz. They imagine warehouses for the elderly. But this is simply home, with the advantage of maintenance-free living and built-in community. The Bridge Club met in a cheerful room overlooking a garden where, even in December, evergreen shrubs and winter-blooming plants provided visual interest. 4 round tables were set up with fresh linens, and the air was filled with the sounds of animated conversation and genuine laughter. "Ladies," Eleanor called out as we entered, "I'd like you to meet Linda Rose, my new friend who'll be joining us today." The introductions that followed were unlike any social interaction I'd experienced in months. These women, ranging in age from their early 60s to late 80s, treated me not as an intrusion or obligation, but as a welcome addition to their group. They asked about my background with genuine interest, shared stories about their own careers and families, and included me in conversations about current events, books, and community activities. Martha Chen, the woman Eleanor had mentioned, was a retired chemistry professor whose lemon bars were indeed divine. Ruth Goldman had been a social worker for the city of Philadelphia for 30 years. Patricia Williams. I nearly gasped when I recognized her as Dr. Williams from the hospital where I'd worked, greeted me with delighted surprise. "Linda Rose! I can't believe it's you," Patricia exclaimed, embracing me warmly. "I've missed seeing your friendly face every morning. How is retirement treating you?" The question should have been simple to answer, but I found myself struggling with how much truth to reveal. These women radiated contentment and autonomy, qualities I'd almost forgotten were possible at our age. "It's been an adjustment," I said carefully. "Oh, the first year is always difficult," Ruth said knowingly. "You spend decades defining yourself through work, and then suddenly you have to figure out who you are when nobody needs you to solve their problems 8 hours a day." But it wasn't the loss of work identity that was destroying me. It was the loss of basic dignity in my own family. Still, I nodded and let them assume my struggles were normal retirement challenges rather than something more disturbing. The bridge games were competitive but friendly, with patient instruction when I made mistakes and generous praise when I remembered successful strategies. For 3 hours, I was simply Linda, not a burden, not a problem to be managed, not someone whose needs were inconvenient, just a woman whose company was enjoyed and whose contributions were valued. During a break between hands, Patricia pulled me aside. "Linda, you seem thinner than when I last saw you. Are you eating well? Taking care of yourself?" The concern in her voice was so different from the dismissive tone I'd grown accustomed to that it nearly brought me to tears. Here was someone who knew me as a competent professional, who remembered my work with respect, who was genuinely worried about my well-being. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then caught myself. "Actually, no. I'm not fine, but I'm not sure how to explain why." Patricia's expression grew serious. "Would you like to talk about it?" "Not here, obviously, but perhaps sometime when we can have privacy?" The offer hung between us like a lifeline. When was the last time someone had asked about my problems and actually wanted to hear the answer? Yes, I think I would. "Give me your number, and I'll call you tomorrow." Sometimes it helps to talk through difficult situations with someone who's outside the immediate problem. I realized I couldn't give her my number because I didn't have access to the phone where I'd be able to answer it. The recognition of how completely my communication had been controlled hit me like a physical blow. That is, my phone situation is complicated right now, I admitted, feeling the familiar flush of shame that came with acknowledging my powerlessness. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained gentle. "I see. Well, we'll figure something out. Perhaps through Eleanor?" When Eleanor drove me home that evening, I felt like I was returning from a different world, one where I existed as a full person, rather than a diminished version of myself. "Thank you," I said as we pulled into Diane's driveway. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." "Linda," Eleanor said, turning to face me with an expression that was both kind and serious. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem like someone who's been convinced she's invisible. Trust me, you're not. You're intelligent, engaging, and have decades of valuable experience to offer. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words landed in my chest like seeds in fertile soil. Inside the house, Diane was waiting in the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral but her posture tense. "How was your afternoon?" she asked, the question delivered with the false casualness of someone who was actually quite concerned about the answer. "Wonderful," I said. And for the first time in months, I meant it completely. "Eleanor's friends are remarkable women. I'm going back next Thursday." "Mom," Diane said, her voice taking on the familiar tone of someone about to deliver disappointing news to a child. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to be driving around with people we don't really know. What if something happened? What if you had another medical emergency?" But something had shifted in me during those 3 hours of being treated with respect and kindness. The woman who'd successfully managed hospital crises for 4 decades wasn't going to be intimidated by a daughter who'd apparently forgotten that her mother was still a capable adult. "Eleanor is perfectly qualified to drive," I said calmly. "And if I have a medical emergency, I'm sure her retirement community has excellent protocols for handling such situations. They probably manage health crises more efficiently than most families do." The subtle dig wasn't lost on Diane, whose face flushed slightly. "I just think you should be more careful about—" "About what?" I interrupted, my voice remaining steady but gaining strength. "About having friends? About engaging in activities that bring me joy? About remembering that I'm still a person with interests and capabilities?" The silence that followed was electric with surprise. Mine as much as theirs. When was the last time I'd challenged their authority over my choices? When had I last spoken up for my own needs and desires? "I'm going to Bridge Club next Thursday," I continued, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "And the Thursday after that, if they'll have me. It's not a request for permission. It's information about my plans." That night, as I lay on my basement cot, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for some dramatic rescue or sudden transformation, but for the possibility that I might be capable of small acts of rebellion that could gradually restore my sense of self. The woman who'd played bridge today, who'd laughed with friends and been treated as an equal, she was still in here somewhere. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I was starting to believe she might be strong enough to fight her way back to the surface. The retaliation began subtly, as it always did with Diane. Small changes designed to look like coincidence rather than punishment. The first thing I noticed was the thermostat. The basement, already uncomfortably cold, became genuinely frigid. When I mentioned it during breakfast the morning after my second Bridge Club meeting, Craig glanced up from his newspaper with mock surprise. "Really? Feels fine to me. Maybe you're just more sensitive to temperature changes. That happens when people get older. Circulation issues, you know. Circulation issues." Another medical explanation for what was clearly a deliberate choice to make my living space uninhabitable. "Could you just turn it up a few degrees?" I asked, hating how much the request sounded like begging. "Energy costs are already through the roof this winter," Diane said, without looking up from her phone. "We're trying to be more conservative with heating. Conservative with heating, while keeping the upstairs at a comfortable 72 degrees, while running space heaters in their home office." While Craig mentioned casually that they were considering installing a heated garage floor for his vintage car collection, the message was clear. My comfort was an optional expense they could no longer afford. The second retaliation was the food situation. The refrigerator, which had always been reasonably stocked with basics I could use for simple meals, suddenly contained only ingredients for elaborate dishes I didn't know how to prepare. Exotic vegetables, specialty sauces, organic items with preparation instructions I couldn't decipher. "We're trying to eat healthier," Diane explained when I asked about the missing bread, peanut butter, and simple proteins I'd been subsisting on. "You should really be eating more fresh vegetables anyway. Better for your digestion." But when I tried to prepare a salad from the available greens, I was informed that those were for tonight's dinner party, and I should ask before taking anything. Ask permission to eat food from the refrigerator in the house where I was supposedly living as family. The third retaliation was the most insidious. The systematic dismantling of my newfound independence. "I don't think Eleanor Morrison is a good influence on you," Diane announced during the week leading up to my third Bridge Club meeting. "You've been different since you started spending time with her. More difficult. Difficult. The word that women received when they stopped being compliant, when they began advocating for their own needs, when they refused to accept mistreatment as normal." "Different how?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Argumentative. Ungrateful. You used to appreciate what Craig and I do for you. Now you act like we're somehow treating you unfairly. The accusation hung between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't realized was burning. Was I becoming ungrateful? Or was I simply remembering what it felt like to be treated with basic respect and recognizing the contrast? I appreciate everything you've done, I said carefully, but I also think I'm allowed to have friends and activities that bring me joy. Of course you are, Craig interjected with the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to a child. But you need to be realistic about your limitations. These women are in a completely different financial situation than you are. It's not healthy for you to be around that level of privilege. Privilege. As if dignity and respect were luxuries rather than basic human rights. What if you can't keep up? Diane added, her voice taking on a false concern that I was beginning to recognize as manipulation. What if you have another medical episode while you're out with them? What if Eleanor gets tired of accommodating your needs? The questions were designed to resurrect my deepest fears. That I was burdensome. That my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. That any moment I might be abandoned by people who'd grown tired of dealing with my inadequacies. But something had changed during those afternoons at Pine Manor. I'd seen how Eleanor and her friends treated each other, with genuine affection, mutual respect, and the understanding that aging brought wisdom rather than worthlessness. Their example had given me a measuring stick for normal human interaction, and by that standard, my family's behavior was revealed as profoundly dysfunctional. Eleanor invited me, I said quietly. She continues to invite me. If she was tired of my company, she'd stop. You're being naive, Mom, Diane replied with the sharp edge of someone whose patience was running out. These people don't know you the way we do. They don't understand your situation. My situation. Another euphemism for the state of dependency they'd created and now seemed determined to maintain. That Thursday, when Eleanor arrived to pick me up for Bridge Club, I was ready and waiting by the front door. A small act of defiance that felt enormous given the tension that had been building all week. But as we drove toward Pine Manor, Eleanor seemed quieter than usual. Instead of her typical cheerful conversation about the day's activities, she drove in thoughtful silence until we were halfway to our destination. Linda, she said finally, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right at home? You seem tense, worried about something. The question opened a floodgate I hadn't realized was holding back an ocean of pain. I don't know if I should talk about it, I admitted. It feels disloyal to discuss family problems with someone outside the situation. Eleanor pulled into a parking space at Pine Manor, but made no move to get out of the car. My dear, loyalty is a two-way street. If someone is mistreating you, discussing it isn't betrayal. It's survival. The word mistreating hung in the air between us. Was that what was happening? Or was I simply being overly sensitive, as Diane suggested? Tell me, Eleanor said gently. What's really going on? So I did. Haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, I told her about the basement room, the confiscated phone, the forgotten birthday, the dismissed medical symptoms, the systematic isolation from normal social contact. I told her about the financial exploitation, the casual cruelty, the way I'd been made to feel like a burden rather than a beloved family member. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly serious as my story unfolded. When I finished, she sat in silence for several long moments before speaking. Linda, what you're describing isn't family conflict or generational differences. It's elder abuse. Financial, emotional, and possibly medical neglect. Elder abuse. The term landed like a physical blow, forcing me to confront a reality I'd been avoiding for months. But she's my daughter. I protested weakly. She's not a stranger taking advantage of an elderly person. She's family. Family members can be abusers, Eleanor said gently but firmly. In fact, most elder abuse is committed by relatives, the people who have the most access and the most opportunity to exploit vulnerable adults. Vulnerable adults. Was that what I'd become? When had I stopped being Linda Rose, competent hospital administrator, and become a vulnerable adult requiring protection from my own daughter? What should I do? I asked, the question emerging as barely a whisper. First, you're going to come inside and play bridge with women who value your company, Eleanor said, her voice regaining its characteristic strength. Then we're going to talk to Patricia Williams. She has experience with these situations through her medical practice, and she'll know what resources are available to help you. That afternoon's bridge club felt different from previous sessions. The conversation and card games continued as usual, but I found myself studying these women with new eyes. They lived independently, made their own decisions, controlled their own finances, and maintained relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. This was what normal looked like for people our age. This was the standard by which I should measure my own situation. During a break between card games, Patricia approached me with the careful manner of someone broaching a sensitive topic. Eleanor mentioned you might benefit from talking to someone about your living situation, she said quietly. I want you to know that whatever you're experiencing, you're not alone, and there are people who can help. I don't even know if what's happening is actually abuse, I admitted. Maybe I'm just being too sensitive. Maybe this is normal family stress? Patricia's expression grew serious. Linda, I've been a doctor for 40 years. I've seen every variation of family dysfunction, and I can tell you with certainty that what you've described crosses clear lines from stress into abuse. The isolation, the financial exploitation, the medical neglect. These aren't gray areas. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. This is for the Area Agency on Aging. They have counselors who specialize in elder abuse cases. They can help you understand your options and develop a safety plan. A safety plan. The phrase suggested danger I hadn't fully acknowledged. Threats I'd been minimizing because they came from someone who was supposed to love me. When Eleanor drove me home that evening, the house looked different to me. Less like sanctuary and more like prison. The windows glowed with warm light that I knew didn't extend to the basement where I'd spend another cold night on a cot that was gradually destroying my back and my dignity. Linda, Eleanor said as we sat in the driveway, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, you have friends who care about you. You're not trapped, even though it might feel that way right now. Inside the house, Diane was waiting with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more calculating. Mom, we need to talk, she said, her voice carrying an ominous finality. Craig emerged from the living room, and together they flanked me in the kitchen like prosecutors preparing to deliver a verdict. We've been discussing your situation, Diane began, and we've come to some difficult conclusions. My heart began racing, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or anticipation. After months of accepting whatever treatment they deemed appropriate, I found myself curious rather than terrified about what they might say next. We don't think this arrangement is working out, Craig said, his tone suggesting this was a business decision rather than a family matter. You're not adjusting well to living here, and frankly, the stress is affecting our marriage. We think you'd be happier somewhere more structured, Diane added. Somewhere designed for people with your needs. Somewhere designed for people with your needs. The euphemism was so transparent, it was almost insulting. You mean a nursing home, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. An assisted living facility, Diane corrected quickly. Somewhere with activities and medical support and people your own age? People my own age who are also inconvenient to their families? The question seemed to catch them off guard. Where had that come from? When had I developed the ability to articulate what I was really thinking? Mom, don't be dramatic, Diane said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. We're trying to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I repeated slowly. Or what's most convenient for you? The silence that followed was electric with tension and possibility. For the first time in months, I wasn't backing down from confrontation. For the first time since moving into this house, I was refusing to accept their narrative about what was appropriate for someone in my situation. I think, I said carefully, that before we make any decisions about my future, I'd like to explore some other options. What other options? Craig demanded, his mask of patient concern slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. Options that might allow me to maintain my independence while getting whatever support I actually need, I replied, thinking of Patricia's business card hidden in my coat pocket. Options that don't involve surrendering my autonomy to people who seem to view my existence as a problem to be solved. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid of the battle that was coming. The business card felt like a talisman in my trembling fingers as I dialed the number for the area agency on aging from the phone booth outside the grocery store. Yes, a phone booth, one of the last remaining relics in our neighborhood, which I'd discovered during my secret walks while Diane and Craig were at work. I'd been planning this call for 3 days, ever since our confrontation in the kitchen, rehearsing what I would say and trying to build the courage to actually make it. Area Agency on Aging. This is Sarah speaking. How can I help you? The voice was warm, professional, and completely without judgment, qualities I'd almost forgotten could exist in conversations about my situation. My name is Linda Rose, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I think I might need help. Someone told me you have counselors who work with older adults who are having family problems. We absolutely do, Sarah replied. Are you in immediate physical danger? Physical danger. The question made me pause. Was I? The abuse had been emotional, financial, psychological, but was there risk of physical harm? No, I said finally. Not physical danger, but I think I'm being mistreated by my daughter and her husband. I'm living in their house, and the situation has become— I struggled for words that would adequately convey the systematic degradation I'd experienced. Unbearable. I understand, Sarah said, her tone conveying genuine empathy. You've taken an important step by calling. Would you be able to come in for a consultation? We have a counselor who specializes in elder abuse cases, and she can help you understand your options and develop a plan for moving forward. An appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a day when Diane would be at work and Craig had a business trip. I would tell them I was going grocery shopping, a lie that felt justified given the circumstances. The offices of the Area Agency on Aging were located in a modern building downtown, with accessible entrances and comfortable waiting areas designed for people who might have mobility limitations. The environment immediately conveyed respect for the dignity of older adults, a stark contrast to the infantilizing treatment I'd grown accustomed to at home. Margaret Sullivan, the counselor assigned to my case, was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen many variations of family dysfunction. Her office was filled with natural light, comfortable seating, and resources about legal rights and support services. Tell me about your living situation, she said, after we'd completed the initial paperwork. Take your time and include whatever details feel relevant. For the next hour, I told my story from the beginning. The grocery store fall that had prompted concerns about my living alone, Diane's insistence that I move in temporarily, the gradual erosion of my autonomy and dignity, the financial exploitation, the medical neglect, the systematic isolation from friends and normal social contact. Margaret took notes but rarely interrupted, allowing me to speak without judgment or skepticism. When I finished, she reviewed her notes briefly before looking up with an expression of professional concern. Linda, what you've described constitutes clear elder abuse across multiple categories: financial exploitation, emotional abuse, neglect, and isolation. None of this is normal family conflict, and none of it is your fault. The relief I felt at having my experience validated by a professional was overwhelming. For months, I'd questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or demanding. To have someone with expertise confirm that my treatment was unacceptable felt like emerging from a fog I hadn't realized was obscuring my vision. What are my options? I asked. Margaret opened a folder and pulled out several documents. You have more options than you might think, she said. First, let's talk about immediate safety. Do you feel safe returning to their house tonight? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I think so. They want me gone, but I don't think they'd harm me physically. They're more likely to try to pressure me into agreeing to their plan to place me in a facility. Good. That gives us time to develop a comprehensive plan. Now let's discuss your financial situation. Do you have income sources independent of your daughter? Social Security, I said. About $1,800 a month. And I think I still have some savings, though I'm not sure how much. Diane has been managing my finances since I moved in. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. Managing your finances how? Do you still have access to your accounts? No, I admitted, feeling the familiar flush of shame. She said it would be easier if she handled everything, paying bills, managing investments. I thought it made sense at the time. We need to address that immediately, Margaret said, making a note. Financial exploitation is a serious crime, and regaining control of your assets is crucial for your independence. Over the next hour, Margaret outlined a plan that felt both overwhelming and liberating. We would start by contacting my bank to verify my account status and change passwords. We would explore housing options appropriate for someone with my income and needs. We would document the abuse for potential legal action. And we would develop a safety plan for when I informed Diane and Craig of my decision to leave. There's one more thing, Margaret said as our session concluded. We have emergency housing available for seniors who need to leave unsafe situations quickly. It's not luxurious, but it's safe, clean, and temporary while you arrange longer-term housing. Emergency housing. The phrase made my situation feel simultaneously more serious and more hopeful. Serious because it confirmed the gravity of what I'd been experiencing. Hopeful, because it meant I wasn't trapped. How quickly could I access emergency housing if I needed it? Within 24 hours of your call, Margaret replied. We understand that leaving abusive situations often requires rapid action. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls that would change my life forever. The first was to my bank, where I discovered that Diane had indeed been managing my accounts, and that my savings of $47,000 had been reduced to $8,000 through a series of loans and family expenses that I'd never authorized or been informed about. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, was sympathetic but clear about my options. We can freeze the accounts immediately and require your signature for any future transactions. However, recovering funds that were transferred with your apparent consent will require legal action, apparent consent. Another phrase that revealed how systematically I'd been manipulated. By trusting Diane with financial management, I'd unknowingly given her legal authority to steal from me. The second call was to Patricia Williams, who listened to my update with the clinical attention of someone accustomed to crisis management. You're doing exactly the right thing, she assured me. I know it feels overwhelming, but every step you're taking is moving you towards safety and independence. I'm scared, I admitted. What if I can't manage on my own? What if Diane was right about my limitations? Linda, Patricia said firmly, you managed a hospital department for 4 decades. You raised a daughter as a single mother. You've survived every challenge life has thrown at you so far. Trust yourself. The third call was the most difficult. To Eleanor, to explain that I might not be able to continue with Bridge Club while I navigated this crisis. Nonsense, Eleanor said immediately. Bridge Club is exactly what you need right now. Routine, friendship, and reminders that you're valued. Besides, we're all invested in your well-being now. You're not going through this alone. That evening, I returned to the house with a plan, a support network, and for the first time in months, genuine hope for my future. Diane was waiting in the kitchen, her expression tight with barely controlled anxiety. Where were you all day? She demanded. You said you were going grocery shopping, but you don't have any groceries. I went to the area agency on aging, I said calmly. I wanted to understand my options for independent living. The silence that followed was electric with shock and fury. Craig appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension in Diane's voice. You did what? Diane's voice was sharp with disbelief. I consulted with professionals about elder abuse, I continued, surprised by how steady my voice remained. I wanted to understand whether my treatment here is considered normal family dynamics or something more concerning. Elder abuse? Craig's voice carried a note of panic. Mom, that's ridiculous. We've been taking care of you. Have you? I asked quietly. Because the professionals I spoke with have a different interpretation of confiscating someone's phone, isolating them from friends, stealing their savings, and housing them in unheated basement rooms. We haven't stolen anything, Diane protested, but her voice lacked conviction. $47,000 reduced to $8,000 through unauthorized transfers, I said, watching her face go pale. The bank has provided me with detailed records. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult life. For the first time, I held power in the relationship. For the first time, I wasn't the one defending my actions or apologizing for my needs. "You have two choices," I said finally, when their protests and justifications had exhausted themselves. "You can work with me to develop a respectful transition plan that allows me to leave with my dignity intact. Or you can continue trying to manipulate and control me while I pursue legal remedies for financial exploitation." "You're making a huge mistake," Diane said, her voice now cold with anger rather than false concern. "You can't take care of yourself. You'll end up in some terrible state facility." "Maybe," I replied, "but that will be my choice to make, and my mistakes to live with. I'm 76 years old, and I'm still capable of making my own decisions, good or bad." That night, I slept on my basement cot for the last time. Tomorrow, I would call Margaret Sullivan and request emergency housing. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rebuilding my life from the foundation up. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the peace of resignation or defeat, but the peace that comes from finally choosing yourself, finally refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, finally remembering that you deserve better simply because you're human. I was no longer a victim. I was a woman in the process of saving herself. 6 months later, I stood in my own kitchen, my kitchen, watching the morning sun stream through windows I could open whenever I pleased, making coffee in a mug I'd chosen myself, preparing to spend a day filled with activities I genuinely wanted to do. The one-bedroom apartment in Riverside Gardens wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every decision about temperature and lighting and food, all mine. The freedom was intoxicating in ways I hadn't anticipated. The emergency housing Margaret had arranged had been exactly what she'd promised: safe, clean, and temporary. For 3 weeks, I'd lived in a studio apartment with basic furnishings while working with a legal aid attorney to recover my stolen savings and searching for permanent housing within my budget. The legal process had been faster than expected. Faced with detailed bank records and the threat of criminal charges for financial elder abuse, Diane and Craig had agreed to a settlement that returned $32,000 of my money. Not everything they'd taken, but enough to secure my independence. The attorney, Maria Santos, had been blunt about my options. We could pursue full recovery through criminal court, but that process could take years, and there's no guarantee of success. The settlement offer gives you immediate access to funds you need for housing and living expenses. I'd taken the settlement, not because I'd forgiven the theft, but because I'd learned to prioritize my own well-being over the satisfaction of punishment. Some battles are won by walking away victorious rather than fighting to the bitter end. The apartment search had been an adventure I hadn't expected to enjoy. After decades of making do with whatever housing I could afford, the process of choosing where to live based on my preferences, rather than just my limitations, felt revolutionary. Riverside Gardens was a senior living community, but nothing like the institutional facility Diane had threatened me with. It was a collection of garden-style apartments designed for active adults who wanted independence with optional support services. The residents I'd met during my tour were engaged, autonomous people who'd chosen to simplify their housing responsibilities without surrendering their dignity. My neighbor, Rose Chen, Martha's younger sister from Bridge Club, had become an unexpected friend and guide to community life. She'd knocked on my door the day I moved in with a plate of homemade cookies and an invitation to join the morning walking group. "First rule of independent living at our age," she'd said with a grin. "Make friends fast and stay busy. Isolation is the enemy of happiness." Rose was 79, a retired school principal who'd moved to Riverside Gardens 5 years earlier after her husband's death. She drove herself everywhere, managed a small investment portfolio, volunteered at the local literacy center, and served as informal president of what she called the Troublemakers Club, a group of residents who advocated for improvements to community services. Through Rose, I'd discovered a world of older adults who'd refused society's expectations about aging gracefully into invisibility. They traveled, started new hobbies, pursued education, began relationships, launched small businesses, and generally behaved like people whose lives were continuing rather than winding down. The bridge club at Pine Manor had welcomed me back with genuine celebration when I'd returned after my month-long absence. Eleanor had insisted on taking me to lunch afterward to hear the full story of my liberation. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said over salad at her favorite restaurant. "It takes tremendous courage to leave an abusive situation, especially when the abusers are family members." "I couldn't have done it without you," I'd replied honestly. "Without Bridge Club, without seeing how normal people treat each other, I might never have recognized how abnormal my situation had become." "Nonsense," Eleanor had said firmly. "You had the strength all along. We just provided the mirror that helped you see it." The work I'd found, part-time administrative support for a small medical practice, had been another unexpected gift. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a family physician who'd learned about my hospital experience through Patricia Williams, had hired me to help modernize their patient record system and train staff on new administrative procedures. "We need someone with institutional knowledge," Dr. Martinez had explained during my interview. "Someone who understands healthcare from the inside and can help us improve our patient communication systems." The job paid modestly, but it utilized skills I'd spent decades developing and provided the intellectual stimulation I'd been missing. More importantly, it connected me with colleagues who valued my experience and treated me as a professional rather than a charity case. My finances, while not luxurious, were stable and entirely under my control. The recovered savings, combined with my Social Security and part-time income, allowed me to live comfortably within my means. I'd opened new bank accounts with passwords only I knew, established a relationship with a financial advisor who specialized in retirement planning for people with modest assets, and created a budget that included line items for travel and entertainment, concepts that had been unimaginable during my months in Diane's basement. The relationship with Diane remained complicated and painful. She'd attempted contact several times, first through angry voicemails about my betrayal and ingratitude, then through Craig's mother, Eleanor Morrison, who'd refused to carry messages, and finally through a card at Christmas that contained no apology, just a generic message about hoping I was doing well. I'd responded with a brief note thanking her for the card and providing my new address, in case she ever wanted to have an honest conversation about our relationship. The offer remained open, but I no longer held my breath waiting for acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. The grief process had been more complex than I'd anticipated. I wasn't just mourning the loss of a relationship with my daughter. I was mourning the realization that the relationship I'd thought we had may never have existed. The mother who'd sacrificed everything for her child's success, and the grateful daughter who'd eventually provide security and comfort in return. That story had been my own creation, not a shared understanding. Margaret Sullivan, who I still met with monthly for counseling sessions, had helped me process the loss without becoming bitter. "The love you gave your daughter was real," she'd reminded me during a particularly difficult session. "The sacrifices you made were meaningful, even if they weren't appreciated or reciprocated. Your worth as a mother and as a person isn't diminished by her inability to recognize your value." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came my 77th birthday, the first I'd celebrated in decades that was actually about celebrating, rather than marking another year of obligations and diminishing expectations. Rose had organized a small party in the community center, with friends from Riverside Gardens, Pine Manor Bridge Club, and my new workplace. We'd eaten cake, shared stories, and laughed until my cheeks hurt from smiling. Patricia Williams had presented me with a photo album documenting my year of liberation, pictures from bridge games, community events, and work functions that showed a woman who looked increasingly confident and joyful as the months progressed. "Look at the difference," she'd said, pointing to photos from my first nervous bridge club meeting compared to recent pictures where I was laughing with friends. "This is what freedom looks like." That evening, as I sat on my small balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment. The woman who'd been discarded in a basement, told she was too old for phones and too frail for independence, had discovered reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. The woman who'd been financially exploited and emotionally abused had fought back and won. The woman who'd been isolated and dismissed had built a community of genuine friendships based on mutual respect. I thought about other women my age who might be sitting in their own versions of that basement, accepting mistreatment because they'd been convinced they had no alternatives. I thought about the daughters and sons who'd learned to see their aging parents as burdens rather than people deserving of love and dignity. Most of all, I thought about the power of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, regardless of your age or circumstances. The power of seeking help when you need it. The power of remembering that you deserve better simply because you're human. My phone, my own phone, with my own number and unlimited access to whomever I wanted to call, buzzed with a text message from Rose. Coffee tomorrow at 8? The Troublemakers Club is planning our campaign to get better lighting in the parking garage. I smiled and typed back, absolutely. Someone needs to advocate for us. Someone needs to advocate for us. The phrase resonated with truth I'd learned through hard experience. If we don't advocate for ourselves, if we don't refuse to accept diminished expectations and degraded treatment, who will? As darkness settled over my new neighborhood, I went inside to prepare for tomorrow. Another day of choices I would make for myself, activities I would pursue because they brought me joy, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or exploitation. I was 77 years old, living independently, working part-time, surrounded by friends who valued my company, and planning a small vacation to visit lighthouses along the Maine coast, something I'd always wanted to do but had never prioritized during the decades when everyone else's needs came first. I was not a burden. I was not too old for technology or friendship or adventure. I was not a problem to be managed or a responsibility to be discharged. I was Linda Rose, and I was finally, fully, freely myself. Have you ever experienced a situation where you felt invisible or undervalued by family members? Or do you know someone who has faced similar challenges with aging and respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Sometimes the most important message we can share is that it's never too late to choose yourself, and that you deserve dignity and respect at every stage of life. Help us spread this message to someone who might need to hear it today.